those of you I've not met, my name is Gemma Tognini. I'm actually just like you. I'm a business person. I'm a citizen, a migrant kid, a mortgage holder. I also write opinion for The Australian on a Saturday. I'm joined by Clare Rowe, who's a clinical psychologist who works with predominantly family law children in the sort of early teenagers, 5 to 12, and Marshall. And Marshall is an online behavioural specialist, and we are going to unpack some of the tougher questions that have arisen from that session. And Erica, if I can ask you to start with, you mentioned that it's not too late to turn the ship. The question that I get asked more than any other in my role as a columnist is, what can I do? But more than that, where do we start? Because from my take on your address, there are so many layers to unpack. Predominantly, we're talking about the ideal idea of a family, which is functional mother and father, financially secure or able to take a pay cut. All of those things are very real, but where do you start when the reality for most, I would say an average amount of Australians, is not that? It's not that case. Where do we start like that?
Well, I suppose you could say it starts with individuals who make good choices. So as a therapist, we say we are our choices. We are the choices that we make. And although we don't all have the same choices, we all have choices. Some of those choices may be, if you are a single parent, that you surround yourself with extended family and you don't try to parent alone. Because when you need to rely on daycare, it's almost assumed then that you are quite alone.
Yeah.
And so I always encourage people who have children or having children to move close to their family. And if they don't do that, then to create extended family around them. It starts with parents.
Right. Clare, I just want to bring you in on that, because we talked earlier about the idea of what a family looks like, and you work a lot in the family court, so you see a lot of variation on that. What are your impressions around the delicacy of that? Because for everybody, it's not a simple proposition.
And I work, as you said, in family law. I see a lot of fragmented families. I see a lot of families in distress. And I think it's important to note, just as Erica has done, that we've always parented in teams or tribes. So
that's exactly right. But what does the team look like in 2024?
Yes, and I think cross-culturally and historically, it could be grandparents, it can be aunts and uncles, it can be community. But in modern day, yes, we have to accept that there are single-parent families, there are blended families, there are same-sex couples raising children, and I think ultimately what families look like from the outface of their form is not so much important. It's more about, can they provide the function of what a good family unit does, which is the stability, the predictability, the safe space, if I can use that word, overused, but it's very important for children.
So one of the things that I love about ARC, and one of the reasons I decided to become involved in a more meaningful way, was the idea of telling a better story. The story that life isn't over if, like me, you had an alcoholic father, if, like me, you grew up in a very dysfunctional, although loving, but dysfunctional and difficult environment. I believe I'm living proof that you can tell a better story. That's all of our mandate, everyone in this room and everyone sitting here today. Erica, if I can come back to you again just quickly on that. I see it as three different pillars: policy, culture, and action. So policy is obviously the things that the government can do or shouldn't do, more to the point. Culture, what we believe about our story, how we write that story, and how we share that story from generation to generation. And then action, at a granular level. Everybody in this room wants to walk away and go, what can I do? Even if it's a small thing. If I can start by asking you that question.
Well, I guess the question is, does culture influence policy? What's the chicken or the egg? Or does policy influence culture? And I would say, given that we're sitting in a room full of many policymakers, I would say that policy can influence culture.
Of course.
And so, having good governmental policies where you support families and support primary attachment figures and have a very hefty paid leave and then up to 3 years of that critical support for families, that really will shape the culture. And I think that's the way you want to think about it. You don't want the policies to be led by culture.
And I think everyone in this room can look at policy of the last few years in Australia and say it's definitely trying to influence culture, and in some areas has succeeded, and we want to try to arrest that. Marshall, coming to you, particularly around the social media piece, which has been in the news here a lot in the last couple of months, legislation to restrict access to minors to certain social media platforms. That's a good start. What do you see in your practice?
Well, we have literally most teenagers on social media now. We've got more than 70% of males, teenage years, on pornography. Their worldview's all affected, and we've got this cry for help because parents don't know how to get their kids off their phones. Teachers don't know how to get them to do study. So the idea of raising the age of first-time access sounds good, sounds laudable. But how we make it happen is a challenge, because right now 13 is the minimum age for a social media account, but kids are getting on it at 11 and a half. 10. So I don't know how 16 is going to be enforceable, but we certainly want to preserve our kids as best we can, because the mental health crisis amongst those on social media at a younger age is just disastrous.
You touched on something that Claire and I were talking about earlier around parents not knowing how to parent, and can you just talk us through the idea of this hierarchy of parenting? I think I'm a boomer in a Gen X's body, and I'm actually fine with it. I think it's a great thing. But I was of the era where my mum was like, I don't care if you don't like me. I don't care if you're mad at me. You can be mad at me as long as you like. You'll thank me one day. And she was right, FYI. But it feels to me, and by observation, and for those of you who read my columns, you'll know I didn't get to be a mum, so I don't say this from a parent perspective, but from an auntie's perspective and friends with children, godmother, that sort of thing. So many parents are afraid to parent. They're afraid to not be liked temporarily by their kids. You see that in your practice. How do you address that?
Yeah, I mean, I think alongside the increase in institutionalised care, one of the most significant things that has happened in parenting over the last year, it's taken one generation, I think, is this whole significant departure to raising children up to a peer level with their parents. And it is a complete and utter burden on children to live with that responsibility, that they are on the same level as their parents. And I think it comes from parents, a form of compassion. Maybe it's the guilt that they're not spending time with their children as well. And I think that, they approach it as if they want to foster openness. And I say to parents, we are pack animals, essentially. We will work ourselves into a hierarchy. The only question is who's on top. And it shouldn't be the 4-year-old, right? And suddenly that's, kind of groundbreaking. I come back, when you've asked what we can do about it, I come back to this word permission. And I think, just as Australians were given permission last year to say no to the divisive referendum, I think parents just need permission from professionals working with families to be able to say no, it's okay. And authoritative parenting is not equal to oppression. That is the most dangerous lie out there with parents these days. Yeah. And I see parents who are terrified and they can't send their children to, have consequences for their children because they've read all the statistics about mental health and suicide rates. And they are the most, anxious generation of parents. And all I need to do is give them some permission to reconnect with a skill set that is biological and that we have been doing for thousands and thousands of years. And suddenly in one generation, we've completely departed in how we approach it.
That's brilliant, by the way. I'm going to talk to you about
I'll
that.
pay you later, Gemma, thank you.
No, I'm mindful of that clock, and I told the guys that the 20 minutes would go really quickly, so I will pick your brain about that later. But Marshall, picking up on that, this idea of permission, my own experience in my network and my friendship group who've had children struggling with online addictions and porn, and there's a great deal of shame around that. And when they discuss it, it's in hushed tones, and I understand that. The idea of permission to be able to say in a school peer group, a parent peer group, for example, we are also having this problem, and how can we form the networks that Neil talked about at dinner last night, community networks, parenting networks, where we are all facing this same challenge, and harnessing the power of that to write a better story. That is, my child was captured by porn, but we turned this corner because of this network and relationship, and that becomes a better story. Is that something that you see as a possibility?
Oh, absolutely. The reality is most parents are terrified at the job, and they don't talk or communicate with others around them and try and upskill. This is why we see this leaning over to be best friends with their kids.
They do on Facebook groups, that's how they connect.
But we know that where parents talk with other parents of the friends of their kids, it automatically expands the net of safety and the attention and the caring, but also kids tend to group with like-minded kids. And so one of the things about engagement with negative behaviours on the internet, be it social media, sexualised social media, sexting or porn, we know that the kids themselves do more of it when they feel that's normal for their friends.
Right.
But when parents get together with other parents at school and say, is this what you struggle with, or how you cope with this? And all of a sudden the parents realise we're on the same page, let's talk about it. And suddenly these kids are no longer hanging around the ones that are leading them astray, but are with a group of kids with like-minded families. Expands out. So we want to empower those schools and other community groups, as well as interparental communication, to just expand that knowledge and that encouragement and that networking.
And of course, coming back to you, Erica, of course, all of the things that we're talking about here, they're not in isolation, and they're not for the sake of talking about individual issues. What we're talking about, of course, is writing that better story, not just for resilient children and functional families, but for an undeniable economic benefit for communities. So families, and this is obviously at a very broad level, families that function well are less in need of social support, social services, able to hold down jobs, less reliant on all of the various things that can drain a family budget. This concept, plus the research that you were talking about in your keynote, in your experience, how much of this gets before policymakers? And if not, why not, in your view?
Well, as I say, there's a lot of myths about institutional care. Some of them are that it's good for children, that children need socialization under the age of 3. So just to give a quick developmental lesson on children, children only do something called parallel play for the first few years, meaning they don't really interact with one another. And what they really require is that attachment security that I talked about. And so that's the first myth. The second myth is that children do better in school later if they start school earlier. That is a myth. Children do better when they put their socks on before their shoes. Their socks being their social emotional development is cared for the first 3 years until their cognitive development is nurtured. If you force children to learn cognitively before they are social emotionally secure, it backfires. You may cram the information into their head, but at some point they will not be good learners. And all the research points to the fact that if you want your children to be cognitive learners later on, you make sure that you provide them with emotional security in the first 3 years. But this is influencing policy, these myths.
And how do we, quick question, but how do you think we arrest that? How do we, it's not, shouting from the rooftops, one thing, obviously conversations like this, another thing. How do we meaningfully and in a material way stem that?
Well, that's why I write books and run around the world talking about this, because I
That's your
think
job.
that but the only way is to use the research. There's really good research. To use the research, I never write opinion. I only write with research. Right. So my first book, Being There, I spent 13 years reading every piece of research, every piece of neuroscience, epigenetics, attachment research. So use the research. It's there. And research is more powerful than myths.
Very true. Clare, your experience again dealing with the family court, and that would be an incredibly challenging environment day in, day out. I want to ask you a tricky question if I can. Sorry, it's without notice. Do you think that your experience in the family court challenges the idea? No, let me rephrase that. I think, I've often thought and wondered if we've been too blinkered and too narrow and myopic in our definition of family. And how that plays out into a conversation like this in terms of developing solutions. So we're looking at solutions. We all know the problems, we all know what we're dealing with, but how do we bring creativity? How do we bring our ability to shape a different story? How do we bring that to the table when it comes to the idea of family?
Yeah, it's about recognising what function the family plays, and I feel like we have had years now of an undermining of the idea of family. And as you said, family doesn't have to be mum, dad, 2.5 children, but the undermining of the value of what family plays in our society, as if it's a lifestyle choice amongst many others. It's not just a private arrangement, it's for society's good. It's literally where individuals are made. And I just say, yes, we can be creative in what family looks like. And I say that as a divorced mother of two myself. But trying to understand what role that family will play for that next generation. And what it is creating structure and order and shielding children from chaos. And I talk very much about the blurring of the lines between the adult world and the child world that has happened. And I've described it as a war on childhood, that we don't have a sanctity anymore around childhood and letting them be children, which feeds into, of course, what Marshall does about social media and so forth.
Yeah, that's a multi-layered conversation. But coming back to those three pillars, we've got a couple of minutes left, but for everyone, as we wrap this panel, these ideas of policy, culture and action, if I can just ask each of you to share with the audience your top couple of ideas about what can we practically do. There are those of us who have different levels of, different spheres of influence, different networks of influence. Erica, policy, culture and action.
Well, Australia is about to pay $135 a day per child to put them in institutional care. If you gave each of those families $100 a day, that would be $500 a week to each family to care for their child the way they feel is best, which would allow those families either for the mother to stay home or the primary attachment figure to stay home, work part-time, or have a trusted family member care for children. And you'd save $35 a day. But in addition, you wouldn't have the rising mental illness statistics that you will have. I promise you, I will be back here in a decade, and I will be crying with you over what has happened to your country if you pursue this institutional daycare.
Marshall.
Well, we're talking, when we're talking about teenagers, we're talking about on the frontier of adulthood, and we're generally trying to recover for most of them the worst of the online world, which has gripped them, including addictive behaviours and warped thinking. So we want to pitch a vision for them. What is a better version of themselves as they move into life? What is a human? How do relationships work? Where is their value? So we've got kids going to school. We have schools that actually have better curriculum that pitches this alternative vision. We want to enhance the engagement of parents with their children. We want to inform them of the risks. We want to show them how to communicate better with their children about that future, about offsetting the negatives, and ultimately we want to get them off technology for as long as we can because it's harming them. So let's encourage alternative things for them to do with their friends in real time, real relationships, activities, ventures, sport, hobbies. Let's generate in our kids excitement about a version of themselves which is not dependent on the narratives of social media and of Netflix and of pornography and all that rot.
Amen. Claire?
I think we need people who are confident in speaking about the value of traditional families, even as outward facing, they may not look like your traditional family, but a revaluing of what they provide children. I think a reinstatement and revaluing of community groups such as church and religion and other community groups that bring families together, because strong, stable families do good when they connect together and are not in isolation. And coming back to the permission, I want to give parents permission to engage with their children's school, to engage with the curriculum, read the curriculum, tell the school that you're not happy with certain things, insist that the curriculum has things that put in place values of respect and civic responsibility and Australian history and so forth. And finally, parents to have permission to take back responsibility for the children that they're raising, and they are wholly responsible for the characters that they are raising in their children, and that they are confident enough to make decisions that are best for their family.
Fantastic. So much to unpack from this panel, and would you join me in thanking our Erica, Marshall and Claire for their time and their expertise and